Hello.
Hi, Jaylin.
Hey. I've been trying to get this glare out, but I also don't want my bathroom up in there. I'll be right back. There we go. Oh. All right. What time are we getting started? 1:30, right? Or are we live now?
We're streaming now. We're going to get started probably about in about 10 minutes, maybe, depending on when people start to trickle in.
Okay. I will start sharing that link around. That's what you get. Don't mess around with that.
Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Balarinwa. I'm a sophomore clinical laboratory science major on a pre-med track, and I attend Howard University, and I serve as the communications and development student intern for GlobeMed. And you're watching the second installment of the Health Equity Speaker Series. I've had the honor of planning and facilitating this series with Sarah, and I'm really excited for all of you guys to watch what Jaylin and Generation Green has to offer. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jaylin. Jaylin Ward is the Diaspora Engagement Director at Generation Green. They are a junior interdisciplinary journalism major from the Bronx, New York at Howard University. Much of Jaylin's academic research is centered on the effects of involuntary and voluntary movement of African descended people in Central America on political identity, economics, social organization, and statehood. The economic scope of their work does not only focus on jobs, rather resources, which most importantly includes access to healthy food. Jaylin's work in the District of Columbia has centered on food insecurity solutions. They've always done work in community organizing through the Girl Scouts of Greater New York. However, in Jaylin's freshman year at Howard University, they organized the Mecca Market with a coalition of students acting as a liaison to the Office of Sustainability. Jaylin's partnership has grown to intern garden manager of the Halo Green Garden, a horticultural community space for healing and free produce. In addition to her cultural and environmental justice efforts, Jaylin is the brand management director for Make Collective, a multimedia production company centered on the stories of Black LGBTQ plus people and women. Jaylin is an overall multimedia storyteller with a plant-based appetite for justice. Through every initiative in their professional tenure, Jaylin strives to achieve intergenerational healing through access to knowledge, education, and real food. I'm so happy to have Jaylin with us, and I'm so excited. So the floor is yours.
Wow, I'm so flattered. I forgot I did all that. Okay, well, no need to introduce myself. Elizabeth did that way better than I could. But just to reiterate, my name is Jaylin Ward. My pronouns are they, them, she, her, or just refer to me as Jaylin. And today we're just going to be talking about the intersections between health equity and environmental liberation. So let's just go straight ahead. I'm going to share my screen so you can see this cute little presentation, and we're just going to vibe out. It's going to be very interactive, so I'm going to ask you guys some questions. I don't like speaking at people. I'm 20 years old. Like, I feel like I don't know any more than you do. I'm just presenting, bringing the information. So we're gonna have a conversation. It's a chat. So let me share. All right. So this is a special presentation on health equity and environmental justice, or environmental liberation, whatever floats your boat. And today is the 18th. So let's take some notes. All right. So today's agenda, we already got through who I am, but let's discuss what Generation Green is right after. We're going to speak on our framework and some of our goals, our ideas for collective action, and a summary of action items. So we already got through who I am. I'm a they, them, I'm a director, yada, yada. And then Generation Green. Generation Green is so young. We launched last year during the pandemic because it was essential. We were out in communities just doing lectures outside on environmental liberation and environmental justice because the pandemic exacerbates so many issues. And COVID specifically in a lot of marginalized communities has been worse because of lasting health impacts from sacrifice zoning and locally unwanted land use, and several factors, housing inequity, and all that impacts health justice. So Generation Green is an ecosystem that strives to foster an intergenerational network and community and platform to fortify youth leadership and environmental liberation across the world, especially in the African diaspora. So our vision is a world where people are liberated through collective action and collective power building, and have the ability to uplift themselves over, taking over like poverty constructs. So we're really about self-empowerment, community empowerment over some of the poverty cycles that allow these issues to persist as opposed to evolve. Keep pressing the wrong button. Okay, here we go. So what is the environment? How does the environment include health inequity, sacrifice zoning, housing inequity, if the environment is like polar bears and trees in national parks? Well, I would like to tell you, if you don't know already, the environment is just your immediate surroundings. And that definition is so important to our scope of work because for a long time, as a Girl Scout, like that's really my basis in the environment. As a Girl Scout, we're taught, this is poison ivy, and, plant a tree after hurricanes, and, amend the soil, and et cetera, but not everybody has access to a green environment with an ecosystem of plants, people, and animals, and of course, climate. Some people are in an environment with their climate and concrete and themselves. And those environments usually include inequities like no access to a supermarket, or over policing, or, living near power plants and petrochemical plants. And there's several locations across the world that have these kinds of environments, these urban environments. And it really impacts health because of a plethora of issues that we'll get into later. So your environment is just your immediate surrounding. It's a space that shapes your experience. It's the air you breathe, the food you eat, your body itself, and the ground you walk on. So what is liberation? I say environmental justice or environmental liberation because justice is the first step. But once you recognize that, maybe this government is unjust, maybe like liberation, maybe justice and reform isn't going to change some of these systemic issues. That's where abolition comes into play, because the game plan just needs to be changed, because in many ways, justice can sustain oppression. And it's important to consider those aspects of society and how we can liberate ourselves and abolish them. So liberation is an individualized and collective decision at the same time. You have to decide what is freedom for you, because you're not free if somebody's telling you what to do, essentially, right? So you have to also think about who you are and what you need. Those are the most important things. That's how you thrive and survive and help others. You need self-care first. But then there's also the collective, because you cannot survive and thrive without community. So you also need to consider, well, how do I empower my community? How am I a part of my community? How can I build this ecosystem? So I think a good way to envision what liberation is, because it can be so ambiguous and theoretical, and justice is so much more tangible. So I like to tell people, consider what you do with your life if you didn't have to fight to live. So if you weren't an activist, what would you be doing? If you didn't feel like there was an issue in this world that you needed to fix and this is your life's purpose, what would you be doing? My little sister told me she'd be sleeping. But also like that is a great privilege to sleep. Like some of this work is very, very draining. Sleep is a privilege, and we don't even consider it that way. Some people have told me they'd be astrologers. They just love the relationship with the universe and connection to what happens on Earth. That's amazing. Some people say, like, they would be chemists, like, they just want to, make beauty products. Like, they want to be beauty chemists. And I was like, wow, these are great answers. But activism and fighting for your life takes up so much of a big part of many people's lives when you're fighting for justice and liberation. So a liberated space is a space where you can do what you want to do, and what you want to do also empowers your community. And that brings me to the last point, that liberation is not one size fits all. So that's kind of connected with the first point. We're not always going to see eye to eye, but that should be okay. It shouldn't create scarcity. It shouldn't create, scarcity. And we'll leave it there and move on. So environmental liberation and health equity, how does this intersect? So healthcare, well-being, and access to these things are affected by policy, culture, and layers of oppression. And solving these issues are integral to environmental liberation. So if you don't have public transportation in your neighborhood, or your neighborhood is surrounded by liquor stores and bodegas and there's no grass, no trees. The biodiversity is grass, fake trees, pigeons, and squirrels. That's the environment I grew up in, and that kind of characterizes the Bronx. And what we see in the Bronx is higher rates of asthma because of this toxic donut theory, which was a term coined by an environmental justice leader in Chicago. So a toxic donut is essentially when you're in the middle, in that little donut hole, and you're surrounded by things that pollute, things that extract, and things that don't necessarily serve your community in the most productive way. So I grew up in that landscape. Fortunately, it was on the edge of the Bronx, so I was closer to like Pelham Bay Park, which is a very large park in New York City, and the Hutchinson River. So I was able to be exposed to, protected areas and those kind of conversations, but implementing the idea of toxicities in industry and extractive industry taking an impact on your health wasn't a open conversation really. So during these times, during these COVID times, the South Bronx has been heavily impacted by COVID-19 because most people in that area have pre-existing conditions, be it obesity because of the lack of access to fresh food, be it undetected issues because of the lack of access to health care, and asthma, which is the hugest issue. There's a saying that in the Bronx that, you know, if you have a friend without asthma, then their parents got money. And it's not, it's not like a saying, it's not a proverb per se. It's more so sad that income affects health issues, but that's the reality that we live in. So if you could pretty much tell someone's environmental situation if you look at their zip code. So I grew up in 10475, and I'd love to show you guys a map, but wasn't prepared with that. Maybe next time. But if you zoom in on Google Maps, you'll see that there is one primary care doctor facility. There is 2 urgent cares, and there is no hospital in that zip code. But there are over 15 liquor stores and over 50 auto industrial businesses, and 2 trash facilities, and 1 peaker plant, which is a fossil fuel produced energy plant for the general energy grid in New York City. And that's just New York. And that's just where I'm from. But in Louisiana, there is this space on the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans called Cancer Valley. And this is because within 10 miles of anywhere in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, there are 30 petrochemical plants. And the saying in Cancer Alley is that we don't know anybody who has a family member that hasn't died from cancer. Why are these sayings so morbid? Well, it's an environmental crisis rooted in sacrifice zoning, which is the practice of segregation, essentially, based on Hulk maps used by the housing industry. So essentially, they'd schedule areas where Black people lived as Schedule 3 and 4, which means do not invest. So retailers and banks and even healthcare facilities will see these Hulk maps and be like, okay, we're not going to put our healthcare center here because it's not profitable. And that leaves people living in those areas or marginalized to living in those areas without access to healthcare, without access to fresh food and even clean water in many situations because of these extractive industries mostly impact groundwater as well. There are videos all over the internet where people are setting a match to their water and it ignites because there's methane in their water. And this is not only an issue in Flint, this is an issue across the United States. And I didn't put Flint on here because I feel like we've all taken that in, but there is still not clean water for everyone in Flint. There is a motion for it. There is a lot of activism around it and policy around it. But to this day, there are people in Flint who cannot turn on their tap water and drink that water. And this affects Black people everywhere. This is not just an American thing. This is not just a Western thing, because the impact of colonialism also brings segregation with it. And my family is from Panama, so we have a long history at Colombia, but I've uncovered this story as well in Colombia, these environmental issues that are exacerbated by colonialism. So currently in Colombia, there is an armed conflict. And this armed conflict is the amassment of centuries of vying for government power and just political degradation that I will not get into right now because that deserves its own presentation. But this armed conflict has, I guess, incited a movement of, I guess we'll call them gangs or communities of people who have armed themselves to protect themselves from police, military, and there are also people who exploit this need for community protection to exploit young Black children into joining gangs that traffic drugs through agriculture. And this armed conflict has caused deforestation in the Magdalena Valley hotspot. So in the south of Panama, there's a province called Darien, and in the northwest of Colombia, there's a province called Chocó, and in western Ecuador, there's Magdalena Valley. And this area is considered a biodiversity hotspot because there's just so many endemic species to that hotspot that are either endangered, critically endangered, or on that track because of human interventions. Some of it is just from living and thriving, needing to eat food, and not necessarily replenishing and regenerating the land. So that's just like an education step, but then there's also politics in this from over extraction for capital gain. So the armed conflict has caused many factions, political factions, to seize land, continue deforestation in these protected areas. And essentially displace people. And there's a group on Howard's campus called Shango, and they do a lot of work with students in Choco who are fighting the armed conflict through political activism, and many have taken asylum in the United States. And I think there's one student who actually attends Howard now, who has spoken with Shango on how the armed conflict has impacted their environment. So that's more information I can share after this. Yeah, so that is just a brief rundown of some case studies that are heavily impacted by health inequities and in connection to the environment. Um, so some of the actions that Generation Green has taken up is, well, what can we do about it? And many of these things are rooted in centuries of just the way things are, centuries of dealing and reckoning with enslavement, reckoning with the human trafficking trade that was the Atlantic slave trade, dealing with displaced peoples, dealing with, oil and just natural resources that are exploited for the benefit of capital. And, that exploitation exacerbates people's livelihoods. So Generation Green is like, well, this is a giant. What can we do? So the first thing is to be able to sustain yourself. You can't fight in the struggle if you're tired. You can't fight in the struggle if you cannot take care of your family, if you cannot take care of yourself and your own health. How are you fighting for health equity, but then you don't invest in your health, right? So you have to make sure self care and organizational infrastructure is prioritized. And in prioritizing, your well being and the well being of your organizational family, you're able to actually accomplish work. So, setting the foundation and creating a social ecosystem amongst your coworkers is very essential to activism, organizing, or whatever you'd like to call it. And then in doing that, you're able to, actually get the work done, do research, actually uncover case studies, look at maps, look at these protected areas. In COVID times, it's kind of hard to visit them to see, like, well, hey, we are an organization in America with platform and money. Like, what can we do for y'all? You can't really do that. So we've been capitalizing on the internet, on making these connections with community leaders abroad and across the United States to formulate and build these case studies. And of course, utilizing that Howard University institutional access to a lot of e-publications to see what environmental leaders and conservation leaders have done already. Um, and another thing that we've done, our second action, is connecting to HBCUs and introducing environmental justice. Many people, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, view the environment as, and climate change as saving the polar bears, saving the bees, but they don't really include themselves in that environment. And there's several reasons for that because of, representation. And much of it is because human life isn't prioritized in conservation. And that's just a fact. I'm taking an environmental studies class right now, and we're discussing conservation. And I'm like, well, how do you guys include the community in this? And mom was the word. So Generation Green is trying to break that cycle between science and human life by including humans in that ecosystem. And we've been doing that with HBCUs because they house an amalgam of students all over the world and all over the United States who may not recognize that they come from sacrifice zones, or that they may know somebody or their family who has come from a sacrifice zone that has been generationally impacted by health inequity and resource inequity. And in the African diaspora, especially, many people are facing climate change already. And it's not something that we can think about as something we can do later, something that we should accomplish by 2030, but rather something we should be fighting for right now. And that brings me to our last action item, which is workshopping and programming with people at all stages, especially young children. I've accepted that the future may not be hospitable for human life because just the governmental push for the changes that we need with tackling the climate crisis aren't being taken serious because we are still stuck in prioritizing capital over human life, and that's just a fact. Climate change is happening right now, not 2030, not transition slowly. We need a just transition, a transition that brings justice to everyone, and that just happens right now. So, what Generation Green does is not telling young children that the world's going to end, that's it, but but fight hard anyway, because that's a little dismal, right? But rather empowering youth to see themselves as change makers as opposed to envisioning change as something you do as an adult, but rather something you could do right now. So that brings me to the group question. How do you envision the future and what is your place in it? And how can we all make that come true? I don't know if this is enabled for people to unmute themselves, but if it's not and you're watching this from the live stream, definitely go off in the comment section. That would be wonderful to read later. But if you can unmute yourself, I would definitely love to get some responses to this question.
I can answer, Jaylin.
Okay.
I think when I think about the future, at some points it is really hard to be optimistic about the future, especially when you're living presently and you're literally seeing things collapse and, people protest and different things like that. But in like my ideal world, I see like an equitable future for everyone. Like where we're just allowed to just be, and be free. And I think in my place in that is what I'm kind of figuring out right now, in not just like my education, but not just my education, but outside my education, like things I'm doing outside of school. And I always try to think of my community as just the people I interact with daily. So what can I do in my community to make that happen? And for me, like what I'm passionate about is health equity and healthcare for all, and above adequate healthcare for all. So if I can educate my community on health equity, even if that's just like two other people, then to me that's adding to my vision of the future. So I think that's my answer.
Yeah, I think our imagination has been stifled by envisioning your future by what labor you can provide, as opposed to how you could, sustain your family, sustain your community. Many things as a child. What do you want to be when you grow up? And he's like, fireman, policeman, teacher. But we should really consider, well, what do you like in the first place? That's a lot of pressure for a first grader. So let's chill on that. Um, but imagine like what is our community need, right? I found that in college. I'm studying journalism, but I love to garden, and I'm not studying botany, but that's because, I have the privilege of using university to, pontificate and imagine and study. And then my role in community is my ability to provide food and to provide healing. Um, And that's just something that I've grown and cultivated and have the privilege to cultivate. But not many people are even given the privilege to imagine what they do outside of generating capital so that, you know, they could break generational curses of poverty. So it's a catch 22. Um, but essentially, you know, freedom lies within your ability to avoid scarcity. And once you realize that the system relies on finite sources and things that aren't regenerative, like oil and fossil fuels, you realize that, wow, my role in society could be, you know, regeneration. And what art is endless, ideas are endless, you know, planting trees can be endless, you know. So there's so many things to consider, and trying to stroke that imagination can be very hard. So this could be a takeaway question you journal about later. Okay. Well, that was it. I wanted to take any questions from the audience just so that I could elaborate on anything. I didn't want to inundate the slides with information because I assume that most of us are either in school or just really into health equity. And I didn't want to overload you guys, but we could definitely have discourse.
I have a question. I'd like to know what you, I want to hear more about what you envision environmental justice looking like for, in practical senses for us.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. So the fact of the matter is that individual actions are not going to reverse climate change. It's just not. Having a hydro flask and, you know, dissolvable detergent and a metal straw and recycled plastic shoes is essentially not going to save our environment with the state that it's in right now. In the 70s, scientists actually uncovered that, wow, wait a minute, there is a hole in the ozone layer. We're using hairspray, it's getting crazy in here, the heat's getting trapped. We don't know what to do, the ice is melting. And politicians in America specifically were like, chill with that. We need oil because our military is out there protecting it for us. All right. We need oil for our energy grid. I need you to pipe down with all this, you know, science stuff. And they actually, the Congress, in I don't want to give y'all a false date, so I will add presentation notes that I'll send to Elizabeth. uh, but essentially, Congress funded ExxonMobil, an oil company, to fund scientists to kind of disprove this newfound research in global warming, climate change, and CO2 emissions. And if you look at I'm sharing my screen, I could just show you. If you Google like climate change map NASA, right? And you go to their time machine. Let's go back and let's go to their time machine. You can see that, oh, why are they starting in 2002? Let's go to global temperature. That might bring us, if we go to like 1970, where the science is coming out, you know, this is not that bad. You know, we're in like the temperature difference of like 1 degree Celsius. Oh no, it's in Fahrenheit right now. So 1 degree Fahrenheit, not that bad. But then as soon as the science ramps up, it gets hotter just 10 years later. And we're already near 4 degrees higher in our North Pole almost in Alaska we see here, and in the global south especially, because this is where the oil extraction is going on. You see this here in the Caucasus Mountains, that this is where the natural resource extraction is happening, and it only gets worse. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and you see already, like, well, the Earth's temperature has risen so much by 2009. And historically in America in 2009, what happens is the recession. And that's because of the housing industry, yes, which is an environmental justice issue. Um, but a lot of these industries have crashed because of just the state of politics in our unnecessary war in Afghanistan, Iran, all throughout the Middle East, trying to secure oil and, establish democracy, and trying to avoid oil oligarchies in the Middle East. And this political insecurity actually really impacted industry in the United States, because the focus is no longer on our science, developing our science and those matters, but rather continuing extraction in the global South. And you can see that, like, over the years, it gets worse the more the American military gets involved in oil and oil extraction. And in the global South currently, um, many countries like Venezuela, Guyana, Nigeria, China are experiencing their own industrial revolution. And that's because of the discovery of new oil or lithium and natural resources that fund the global north's ability to make solar panels and to make lithium batteries for things that we feel are consumer items that'll make the world better. But the issue at large is our chain, and a lot of the change that we'll get is through the abolition of using extractive materials, because essentially they're being protected with military power, and that causes armed conflict and displacement. And those are other justice issues and health inequity issues. So, a lot, in short, liberation requires demilitarization. Justice requires holding governments accountable. And that cannot be done unless people band together to get it done. And right now, we have put climate and environment into like a niche area of social justice, and we haven't united it as like a people's struggle. Like, the environment and climate crisis movement is really siloed from other policy areas, and it's seen as something that is cute, something that looks like a metal straw, when in fact it's not. It's policy change and cultural change, and it just changes the way we interact with other countries and people, marginalized people across the world. So it's a big fight. It's a big fight. And it's interdisciplinary as well. You cannot tackle the climate crisis without tackling our supply chains and the way our economies thrive.
Thank you so much for answering that question. That was such a comprehensive answer. I feel so like I have a lot to think about now, but we have a question in the chat, so I'll read it out.
Yeah.
Rachel is asking, what are tangible steps we can make as students to get involved in the conversation and advocacy of health equity and our health, especially as someone who is very new to this discussion and wants to get involved beyond just reading and learning about current issues, but rather coming up with action-based ideas and plans? That's such a good question, because I think, like, right now, in terms of environmental justice, it was always like growing up, that was just something that like scientists, they had that covered, like climate change, that was for them. Right. But now seeing like, especially just the, intersectionality of the Black justice movement, health equity, and environmental justice, I think everyone wants to know, like, how can we actually get involved beyond just learning?
Well, Rachel, can you use your mic? Because I'd love to break this down into kind of a imagination question, because this is really about what you see your talents are, what you can contribute to others, and seeing how you can connect that back to health. So,
Hi,
what do you?
Jaylin. I can use my mic. Thank you.
Yeah. So, what do you like to do? What do you feel like engenders passion in you, and that can help you figure out your ecosystem role in solving health inequity. Yeah. So I'll pass the mic to you.
Yeah, so I'm a pre-med student as well, and I definitely say that my passions lie with people and being able to better improve the well-being of people, whether that's their physical, mental, emotional health. And I guess for a long time, I never really considered, global health and health equity and the environment. And, you know, I kind of like this saying that GlobeMed sometimes throws out, and it's like, what have we been blissfully unaware of? And that's something for a while that I've been blissfully unaware of. And it's, not because I don't want to be knowledgeable and things like that, but I really feel strongly now that I want to use the resources I have and whatever privileges I have to raise awareness and advocate for people who cannot do that. So I'm very people passionate. I guess really what I want to know though is what action-based things can I do, because I want it to go beyond just, being knowledgeable about current issues and reading and articles and things like that. I want to know what I can actually do to get involved and really evoke change.
That's a great question. That's a great realization. And your connection to people is going to be your greatest gift. Your ability to talk to people is going to be your greatest gift, because people living in sacrifice zones, people facing these health inequities, having to take the train or the bus or drive for miles to get groceries and fresh food, are the people who are going to tell you what they need. And it's going to be a decolonization process of, feeling like you need to speak for people who can speak, or, amplify voices that aren't heard. We need to remove ourselves from the center of getting that done and creating a community around it. So your connection to other people is going to be your strong suit in seeing what actions you can do. Because people are going to tell you directly, like, listen, all this climate change stuff is great, but I need a supermarket. Like, I am hungry. And you can be like, okay, how can we create a regenerative supply chain? I want to be a doctor. They need a supermarket. Your ability to talk to people is going to be great, because you want to include farmers, local farmers in that. You want to include scientists in that. How can we regenerate their soil? You want to talk to people who are interested in real estate and be like, how can we create a co-op for fresh food? And how can I put my practice, my medical practice, near that and in these communities? And what kind of care do people want? Is mental health, generational mental health issues really prevalent in this neighborhood specifically? Are people looking for a primary care doctor? Like, doing a community needs assessment will really help your work moving forward. And kind of like being a journalist and getting buddy with the community you want to serve is really going to help, because no one can tell you what they need faster than the people who need it themselves, right? So definitely stepping away from this observation lens and more so getting elbow to elbow with people who are facing current inequity. And yeah, that's all I could offer. You're welcome. Any other questions?
We have three more questions, so I can read them out to you. The first is, how do you see universities as historically divisive and oppressive institutions hurting or helping our current climate crisis? And I think I have to add to this because when I was going to Howard, I always thought that I was going to be now a part of this amazing, Black justice movement, and I was going to, power to the people. I was going to make change. And it was really like sad when I realized that, we're adding to gentrification, we're adding to all these things. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on that.
The fact of the matter is that no matter what color you are, no matter what ethnic origin you are, no matter what race you identify with, there are capitalists in your community. Howard University is ran by Black capitalists because education in America is seen as a business. And that's just what it is. And as a student, you're sold this like, Thurgood Marshall went here, Zora Neale Hurston wrote for the Hilltop. Like, we're sold that. And you're like, great, I'm gonna yada yada. But when you realize that Howard University has helped the CIA like oppress Black activists in the past, like, like, and the CIA recruits at Howard University, and there are Black people who have infiltrated like different movements because identity is weaponized in capitalism because it allows you to sell it for money, right? And then you're in this catch 22, like, well, dang, my community has been oppressed. We need money. But the idea is not that you need money, you need capital. Because if there are people today who are existing within volatile governments and their money does not matter. Like, stuff at the grocery store costs tens of thousands of dollars. Imagine like trying to buy butter and it costs $15,000. It's because of inflation, and inflation is a direct relation to your economy. So if your economy depends on extraction, it all goes back to extraction. If it depends on extractive labor and extractive practices, just down to how the machines work, then it's going to create scarcity. And HBCUs and all universities are a part of that because they haven't divested from coal, they haven't divested from oil, because that's where the revenue is at. So they cannot serve as an institution for Black thought or just, academia in general if they cannot support its students. And that's why college costs so much money. And that's why academia is such an insider circle, because essentially our supply chain relies on extraction. But what's good about universities and good about, academic spaces is that it fosters research. And in that research, students can innovate ways to divest, innovate ways their university and their communities at large can, get into solar, get into wind, get into, hydroelectric energy, how we can regenerate soils, how we could, create infrastructure from recycled material, how we could, basically work with what we have now without taking from the earth anymore. Because that is what's going to evolutionize, not revolutionize, because we don't want to go 360. We don't want to get back to where we were, but we want to evolve, end up on the other side of where we are today. So universities rely on money to run, and money is generated from, extraction. So until we figure out how not to extract, and that it's a good thing not to extract, and oil isn't the end all be all of energy, and we can go somewhere.
Thank you. So our next question is, what is yours and Generation Green's opinion on POC and Black environmental organizers doing most of the work towards alleviating the climate crisis, but not getting the same media recognition as their white counterparts? And how do your goals and hopes as a journalism student play into this?
Right. So at Howard, you learn the importance of the Black press, the importance of community like news wires, and even social media, like becoming that investigator yourself, because we cannot expect the journalism industry, which is basically supported by philanthropy, and that philanthropy is made way by billionaires. We can't expect something that is a part of the problem to shed light on its flaws. Like Bell Hooks has said, master's tools will not destroy master's house, right? So I think we need to remove our expectation from being included into what can we create on our own. And Generation Green is really striving to do that. We are going to have our own blog where it's going to be very easy to submit. You don't need to, really, we're trying to lower the entry point into journalism because it's necessary, right? People want to see, your clips, what university you went to, how many prestigious internships you've had. And a lot of these things come at a cost that don't appreciate your labor as a student or a person in general. So we're really trying to remove that by creating our own media, creating our own platforms that get out news happening across several diasporas, especially the African diaspora, and just creating our own media. That is the point. Like, The Atlantic just wrote a story on W.E.B. Du Bois' Brownie's book, and how that changed a lot of Black children's idea of themselves. Because in mainstream media, all you were seeing is like Black children being used as alligator bait, Black children, being rambunctious, Black children eating lead paint, and, things that are negative impacts on the Black psyche. And what Du Bois did was, all right, let's create the Brownies book, a magazine for Black children to have better images of themselves. And fostering that imagination and fostering that, individualized space for community is so important. And every community needs to replicate this for themselves so that we could have better, you know, images of what we can do, right? So Generation Green is really centered on helping Black people everywhere. And that's not to say that, there's no allyship and that there is no room for people to contribute, but we just recognize the importance of doing for your own community, because in so many ways that is blocked. Like, if you've watched Judas and the Black Messiah recently, you realize that there's really people who do not like the idea of communities empowering themselves. So we just think it's very important to fortify and protect that.
Thank you. And I did watch that movie recently. I had some mixed reviews. It just made me mad, but that's a conversation for another time. So our last question is, how can our network and those working to expand global health equity see health inequities as eco inequities and vice versa? And this is definitely a question I have, especially with my page, Project Lafayette. Like, now, especially, I'm always wondering how I could, get involved. So I think that's a question that would be really valuable to answer.
Mm-hmm. So is the question, how can we see health inequity?
Like, how can, so GlobeMed is, a university-based network. So we have chapters at different universities. So how can our GlobeMed network contribute to the fight against eco inequities and see eco inequities as global health inequities?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that goes back to how we define the environment, and that's seeing that as your immediate surroundings. And if in your immediate surroundings, take for example, Haiti. I see Ayana's on here. She's educated me on this. But in Haiti, there is an endemic tree species that basically keeps the soil together. And because of clearing the land for agriculture to produce coffee and sugar cane for France and the United States at several points in history, that's caused the that has caused the soil to basically erode. And it's in a very vulnerable space in the Caribbean where hurricanes and earthquakes are prevalent. And that's just how the earth is in that area before even colonization. Like, there are accounts post colonization, of course, where like these I'd say barons and these socialites and people who've curated, academics who've curated like encyclopedias or just kept notes of their life have written that there's been tremors for months. So this is before like, we've really got into the extraction process of deforesting everything and, monocropping. So it's just, there are several locations in this world that are just environmentally vulnerable. And then the process of extraction and, extractive labor has exacerbated that. So what GlobeMed can do, I don't know if you guys are a nonprofit organization. Are you guys considered nonprofit or, right? That status? Yeah. So that status puts you in a position where, you work with people who have money to redistribute that. And essentially that's the nonprofit industrial complex. And that puts, power in the hands of few to speak for many. And what GlobeMed can do is assess community needs and create transferable skill workshops and transferable skill platforms for communities they interact with to empower themselves and not need GlobeMed, you know? And I think you guys have done a really good job from your website to not march into communities and be like, you need this and we're gonna leave, right? So definitely continuing to do the work where there's community needs assessments, and then the community is actually taught how to maintain that, and they teach you their cultural practices and what could work best for their environment. That'll be a great way to start actions that last and have an impact on people's lives and a better earth and a better world and a better society. So definitely not gatekeeping access to knowledge and capital and spreading that. And in partnering with universities, that can be the habit, because all universities also have nonprofit designations for the work that they do as well. So not being a gatekeeper of information is really important to getting communities involved in sustaining that.
Thank you so much. I think that's the last question. So I'd like to thank you again for your wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for coming. I think, wait, there's a Google form, like a feedback form, so you can fill out the survey, just so we know what to change and what to keep. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day and stay safe. And thank you again, Jaylin.
No problem. And before we go, definitely follow Generation Green on Instagram. We are very active on Instagram. We're trying to get on Twitter. But our Instagram is generation__green. If you want more information on the things I've discussed and more connections to resources to make these community needs assessments we've been chatting about, definitely email me. I'll drop it in the chat. This is my direct email. It's my name, Jaylin.Ward, my last name, at gen-green.org. And shoot me an email like, let me see that presentation, let me see your resources, I want to learn more. And I would have no problem sharing that. Yeah. And definitely visit our website if you feel compelled to donate, because we need that. And that's gen-green.org as well. It's in the chat now.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, and thank you guys for listening. It was such a pleasure to talk about what we do.